This is Ari Koretsky, and welcome to Jews You Should Know, introducing the broader community to interesting and inspiring Jewish men and women making a difference in our world. Some are already famous, some not yet so, but each is a Jew you should know.
We are back with another fabulous episode of Jews You Should Know. This week, such a powerful story. Stephen Flatow is someone I first heard speak over 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago, in 1996 at a National Conference of Synagogue Youth, NCSY, convention. It was shortly after his daughter Alyssa had been murdered brutally in Israel by terrorists, and in the many years since, he has become an incredible champion for victims' rights. He has pursued the regime of Iran vigorously and earned a massive judgment, a settlement against that state sponsor of terror. He's a prolific author of hundreds of columns and now a book, a memoir of sorts, detailing all of his battles on his daughter's behalf and on behalf of other victims of terror. And really, all in all, an incredible human being, passionate Jew, and defender of the Jewish people. What a treat to have a conversation with Stephen Flatow today. Meanwhile, a reminder as always to subscribe wherever you're listening, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, wherever you may be listening. Chime in with comments or questions at jewsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at JewsYouShouldKnow, spelled out fully on Instagram and Facebook, and Jews You Should Know with the letter U on Twitter. And now to our conversation with advocate, author, activist, passionate Jewish fighter, Stephen Flatow. We are here with Stephen Flatow, an attorney, author, and advocate, an activist. I think that's 4 A's right there. With a fascinating story, a story that does involve some tragedy, but tragedy that has really transformed into incredible service of the Jewish people. And I first actually met Mr. Flatow about, just 26, 27 years ago at a Shabbat experience I was at through NCSY, I think in New Jersey, if I'm recalling correctly. But my first time seeing him since. So how are you?
I am not going to complain. By the way, that's the first time I've ever gotten 4 A's in my life at one time. We're coping like everybody else right now. Personally, I feel very frustrated that I can't get to shul. I learned my chavrusa, by Zoom, but it's not the same having a guy on the other side of the table from you. My kids I miss, but we do FaceTime and we do phone calls. I try to talk to them every day. And like someone said to me, a couple of months ago, this too shall pass. I know there's a phrase in Hebrew for it, but I can never say it. It'll pass. I'm concerned about the future of chinuch in America. How are yeshivot going to adapt, if they have to adapt at all? I'm concerned about higher education, getting kids to Israel for a gap year. The midrashot and the seminaries are going to be, and the yeshivas are going to be suffering greatly in the coming year if they're depending on American students. I know parents are very concerned. And it's funny, over the years, they used to be concerned about terrorism. And that was the question parents would ask me, should I send my child to Israel? And I always said yes. And now the concern is this virus. And if a parent asks me, should I send my child to Israel? What's my answer going to be? I know that some of the, I can speak specifically about Nishmat in Jerusalem. What they are starting to do as the summer program begins is to break the girls up into, let's call them, they're calling them seed pods. I'd rather think of them as silos, so that they're in the same group with the same 8 or 9 women all the time, and even within that, there's a bit of separation and things like that. So the virus not only takes away our physical health, but it takes away our spiritual health as well. And we're going to have to adapt. But if there's a people on this planet who can adapt, it's the Jewish people. We've been doing it for 2,000 years, and we'll figure out a way.
Yeah, you see already in Israel how advanced they've become, how far ahead of the curve they are compared to the United States. So many breakthroughs reading about every day, and it's really incredible. Well, as I mentioned, I came across you first in 1994. I believe it was 94.
I think it was 96, actually.
It wasn't 96. Okay, that would be my senior year of high school. So makes sense. And see, your memory's a lot sharper than mine. And so that's quite a while back. But I've actually read many of your writings and followed a lot of your advocacy work and activism work since then. But of course, there was a long life that led up to that. So take us to the beginning and tell us a little bit about where you're from and how and where you were raised.
Well, the interesting thing is I once read that it's the first 10 or so years of your life that really make the deepest imprint on you. And I spent the first 12 years of my life in a little section of Queens, New York called Middle Village. To me, Middle Village was our universe, and it was our family doctor. We didn't have pediatricians and stuff like that. He delivered babies. He took care of you when you were sick. He took care of your father, your mother, everybody. We had our barbershop. We had my uncle's fruit and vegetable store. We had a movie theater. We had anything you could possibly name within the radius of this little town. A few years ago, I took my granddaughter Michal there for a tour. And when I plotted it out on the Google map, I realized that the first 12 years of my life was spent in an area less than a square mile. But it was complete. There were 3 shuls within 3 blocks of each other, the one that you belonged to and the 2 that you wouldn't step foot into other than for a bar mitzvah. The public school was a long 2.5 blocks away from my house, which I walked to. Morning, come back for lunch, go back after lunch, and come back at the end of the day. We played baseball and punchball on concrete. Life was certainly simpler in those days. But the fact was, we had everything we could want. And then in 1960, we moved to Monsey, before it was Monsey. I mean, there was some Hasidim there at the time, but not to where it became over the next 10 years. And now today, the community that I grew up in for the next 10 years was pretty much unrecognizable to me. And there you needed a bicycle to get anywhere. Your mother had to drive you. My mother didn't know how to drive. So here was this 5-foot-tall woman getting behind the wheel of a 1949 Buick without power steering, with a cigarette dangling from her mouth, driving me places to get to appointments, to go here, go there. And then in New York, you could drive at 16. So 16 was the big liberator. It was my sophomore year of high school, and which I went to public school. And that's when things, began to open up. But it was not the city. I had an afternoon Hebrew school education, both in Queens and in Spring Valley. But I was very lucky. For several years, we belonged to a Reform temple. And the rabbi, Louis Frischman, who passed away a couple of years ago, just understood what he had to do with high school kids and with college kids. And while I was in high school, he made sure that he always put together at least twice a year, a Friday night, where the students would run the services. No, they're not what you call, not what I would call Orthodox services. They were, Reform services. And we even read from a Torah Friday night in those days. And even when I was in college, he'd call ahead and when is Stevie coming home for his break? And then he would sit down with 4 or 5 of us and do the same thing, maybe twice a year again. So I was no stranger to, synagogue life. But the real turning point came, it was 2 events, actually, 2 turning points. The first was my father passed away in 1976, and I made sure to say Kaddish at least once a day for him for the, for the first year. And I began to understand how synagogues operated, at least on a prayer basis, what the routine was, how you accomplish certain things. the difference between Hagba and Galila. These were things that we had never been taught before. Not that you would be taught them, but the real change in life came in 1979 when Elisa was 4 years old. And to boil it down, she said, "I'm not going to public school." She wanted to go to a Jewish school. And for some reason, my wife and I did that. We were concerned because our lifestyle up to that point in time had been what I would call a typical Jewish American lifestyle. Yeah, we lit candles Friday night. I made kiddush. Sometimes already dark when I did that. Saturday morning was Saturday, and I used to bond with my girls. We didn't call it bonding. It was actually, in those days, going to the hardware store. Bonding is a 21st century term. And in the afternoon, it was Mommy's turn to bond at the mall. We had all kinds of crazy stuff outside of the house. In the house, we kept kosher. But we were lucky to realize after about 4 or 5 weeks that how are we gonna keep Elisa's head on straight, where she's learning about the Chagim and Yom Tov and Shabbat and the state of Israel, and then say to her on a Saturday, let's go to the hardware store. So we started going to shul, and we were very fortunate. She was an excellent student. Sometimes we'd have to point her in the right direction on her homework assignments, but then she would dive into them, and she got excellent grades. And she just.
Do you have any idea what early on, she was 4 years old, what triggered her desire?
She was in the Orthodox nursery school in West Orange,
which you sent her to because just for convenience?
It was the only one. It was the best one around. When we moved to West Orange, people were hawking us to go to the JCC. And in those days, they used to have lines outside to register at 4 o'clock in the morning. My wife says, "I'm not standing on a line to send to the nursery school." So, we paid the tuition. She went to congregation A, B, J, and D in West Orange. But she never came home proselytizing or anything like that. It was just, she loved the warmth of it. And even when we lived in Spring Valley for a year, she went to a nursery school at the Reformed Temple, at Temple Beth El again, and she just warmed to the idea of Yiddishkeit. She never hit us with it. It was simply, we developed along with her, and her 4 siblings who came after all followed in her footsteps. And now, I hope it's not embarrassing, my daughters cover their hair. Their kids are all in yeshiva. My son made Aliyah because New Jersey wasn't big enough for the both of us, and he lives in Yerushalayim. And my grandchildren, I have 16 of them, and they don't know it from anything but. You see, my kids growing up knew from the but my grandchildren don't.
Did your wife have a similar background to you? It sounds like she also had grown up in a more reform kind of setting.
Well, my wife grew up conservative. She said she was conservative, which means that, the parents went to shul occasionally on Shabbos morning, then the father went to work in the afternoon, but he wouldn't cut the lawn on Shabbos. This is the type of stuff that we were used to. We always did 2 nights of Seder. Didn't know what the heck we were talking about, really. It was only until, the kids brought home the Jewish education to me that I was able to figure out which end is up. And now, 25 years later, I got a chavrusa from Elisa's mother. I got a chavrusa. I learn every week. I read stuff online. I'm saying Mishnayos, reading Mishnayos for descendants now. I mean, she brought me to some level.
It's incredible that a little girl could have such an impact on generations, if you think about it.
Yes, and it's in the book. It's all in the book.
And we'll definitely talk about the book. Were you practicing law at this time? I guess, was that always your career?
I was admitted to the New York bar in 1974, the New Jersey bar in 1978. And I've been in the title insurance business since 1973. I'm one of those people who is very lucky. I love what I do. I just love what I do. I am trying to slow down in the office a little bit. I brought in my daughter and son-in-law as partners, and I wanted to do more of the business end. I thought I was going to slow down 2 years ago, but I wound up opening an office near our home in Long Branch, so that's where I am.
That's the wrong direction if you're trying to slow down.
Well, there's another thing. This office is a great place for shalom bias. You can read between the lines.
Gotcha. And so you've been a practicing title attorney for many, many years, which I imagine is a very different kind of law than you would eventually kind of get into in terms of the advocacy work and the lobbying and all that kind of stuff down the line.
180 degrees.
But in any event, you had this sort of developing Jewish family, and sounds like you had Elisa, your oldest, and then 4 that followed, and going to Jewish day schools and developing and deepening your own family observance. And then your oldest daughter, I imagine, went to Israel to do a gap year. Is that right?
Actually, Elisa had been to Israel 5 times before she enrolled at Nishmat in 1995. The Nishmat program was for 6 months. She had taken a leave of absence from Brandeis University. She didn't want to do a gap year for a number of reasons. But as I said, this was her 6th trip. From the old days of making, hearing from your kid, once every 10 days to today, where you can Skype and you could WhatsApp, instantaneously with your kids in Israel. She was away, and people would say to me after her murder, "Weren't you nervous when she was in Israel?" And I would tell them I was more nervous when she was in Manhattan at a Sweet 16 or at a concert. That's when I was nervous. When she was in Israel, I slept like a baby. So her going to Israel in January of 1995 for 6 months was nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, we encouraged it. And frankly, she was studying the subject she wanted to study. She was moving up and up in her levels of chavruta with the other women. But more importantly to her, she wanted to be able to go to the kotel, not just to daven, but to watch. She was a great people watcher. And that's how she learned. She once wrote an essay. She was applying for a camp counselor's position. She didn't get it because she was too young. But she wrote in the essay, "I like to have friends who are more religious than me and who are less religious than me, so I can learn from those who are higher, and I can help teach those who religious standards are not up to mine." So she never shut anybody out as a friend based on their religiosity. She was a kiruv machine. There's a story I tell occasionally. When she first started high school, the first school in Paramus, we were having Shabbos dinner, and her phone started ringing in her room. And I heard the answering machine come on. It was one of her friends from high school. I said, "Elisa, tell them not to call you on Shabbos." So the next week, the phone didn't ring. So I found out during the Shiva, when I was telling over that story, that my wife knew that Elisa didn't tell her friends not to call, period. She said, "If you don't have to call, don't call." She turned down the volume on her answering machine so we shouldn't hear it. Her friends were very precious to her. And when you ask her friends about her, the first thing they will say is her smile and her welcoming appearance or countenance. And that's how I think of her today, with a big smile on her face. The last photograph we have of her was taken a week or so before she was murdered, with a big smile on her face. And that's what she brought to her friends, was the smile, the encouraging word, the hug when you needed it, and to cry with you when you needed it. But at the same time, being the stern mother. Her roommate tells a story, which is in greater detail in the book, about how one of their classmates had gotten killed in an automobile accident in Long Island, and her roommate was simply distraught, absolutely distraught. She didn't want to go to class. And after Elisa listening to her and holding her for 15 minutes, said, "Okay, get your books and go." She went. And people just tell you, you hear these stories over and over about of what she did in their personal lives and how she intervened. Now, of course, the family doesn't see the same thing, because I once asked her to help her brother with his studies, and she basically told me he's on his own. I was on my own, he's on his own. So in that regard, she wants him to learn the way she learned, not necessarily struggling, but face what it is and just address it.
So did she have any early ambitions? Did she have a sense of what she wanted to do when she grew up, so to speak? What were her passions?
It was only during college that I think she started thinking about what she would do in the future. For some reason, it was the realm of physical and occupational therapy was being talked about by not only her, but her other friends as well. because that would give you the ability to work hands-on with other people. So I don't think that she was interested in having a legal profession or something like that, but the idea of working with people to make their lives better, I think, is what attracted her. Not that she was able to start any courses or anything like that. I think she was looking to finish her college degree and then see where life brought her. But in the back of my head, I believe that's the kind of work that she would have been. I'll never forget when I was talking to a doctor one day. He says, "So what's your daughter's major at Brandeis?" And I said, "Sociology." And he said, "Oh, that must make you excited, because we're, not to knock sociology or anything like that, but where do you go with a degree in sociology?"
Hard to monetize that degree. Yeah.
Right. We never heard that word monetize when I was in law school or college or anything like that. We said, "I want to get a career. I want to be a lawyer." That's what I said.
We'll add it to the 21st century dictionary with bonding.
Right.
There you go. So Elisa was, I guess at some point she was back in Israel. Was it after college? When did this tragedy occur?
The middle of her junior year. I couldn't figure out why she was working so hard during her freshman and sophomore years and the summers also. She was taking extra courses. She had a game plan. And it was important to her that when she went to Israel, it not be on that structured program that the gap year requires you to take. So she really loaded up herself for those first 2.5 years of Brandeis to finish 3 years worth of requirements. So she applied for this leave of absence, which they gave her. So basically, when she came back from Israel in the summer, the end of the summer, she would have started her senior year at Brandeis without losing any school coursework at Brandeis. So the terror attack took place in April. We had spoken to her the night before. She was going on vacation before Pesach. We would think of going away for Pesach as a vacation, but in Israel, she wanted to go away a few days before. Schools were closed. She wanted to get a suntan. And then she would do her 1 day of Yontif, one Seder, and she'd be back home in a couple of months. And of course, that never happened.
So take us to the actual events, the tragedy that did occur in her murder. Bring us there, and what happened?
We spoke to her. It was late Saturday night in West Orange, where we lived at the time, and it was 6 or 7 a.m. in Jerusalem. She was getting ready to board a bus, and that's when she told me she was going to Gush Katif. Originally, she had planned to go with a couple of friends to Petra, and I put money in her bank account so she'd have enough cash to do that. But her friends didn't have the bank of dad at home, so they changed their plans. And frankly, Ari, I asked her where Gush Katif was. I know she wanted to get, a vacation, right? I figured it was near Nahariya, near Netanya, near Tel Aviv, and then she told me Gaza. So in those heady days of the Oslo Accords, there were people, we didn't have any illusions about what Gaza was like, but I had given Elisa rules to travel with. The first one was take a public bus. The second was don't go by yourself. And the third was have a recognized destination in mind. I don't want you camping out in a wadi someplace in the Judean desert. And she followed my rules. So she and 2 companions got on a bus, and they switched another bus in Ashkelon. And that's the bus that drove into Gaza. And it was heading towards the community of Kfar Darom to let people off when a van that was parked alongside the road burst out, slammed into the side of the bus, and exploded. The next morning in America, it was 8 a.m. I was late for shul. It was Sunday. And I turned on the radio and I heard of this terror bombing in Gaza. And I knew in my heart she was involved. I just knew. I didn't want to go back in the house and alarm my wife with my feelings. So I continued to shul, and 10 minutes later the phone rang. And it was my wife calling to tell me she just hung up from the mother or father of one of Elisa's traveling companions. The bus the girls had been in had been bombed. Her friends were already back in Jerusalem, but they were separated from Elisa at the scene of the attack. I went home, obviously, and I started making phone calls, and the American embassy in Tel Aviv located her in Beersheba. at Soroka Medical Center. And after speaking to 2 doctors that morning who told me I should come right away, got on a plane that afternoon, flew to Israel to be with her. She died the next day with me at her bedside. And we decided to donate her organs. And because of the time frame and the flight arrangements, things like that, we couldn't get back from Israel to the States until Wednesday morning. So she died on a Monday, funeral was Wednesday, and we sat Shiva for 1/2 of a day, and then the next day being Thursday, we got up from Shiva Friday morning, Erev Pesach. And we were just flooded with well wishes, People making Shiva because there was a line out the door. And on Thursday morning, late Thursday morning, early Thursday afternoon, there was a man sitting there with his son, very yeshivish to me. And I said, "Did you know Elisa?" And he said, "No, but we came to pay our respects because we had to." And even today, 25 years later, I run across people who tell me, I was at her funeral. 2,000 people were there. And she just had this impact. And what I've done every day since then is try to do something in her honor that makes the world a better place. So sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. I take the failures in stride. I don't let them get me down. And in 1996, I embarked upon the great adventure of trying to get an American law adopted. And let me tell you, legal training does not prepare you for that. It doesn't prepare you. The law was called an Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, but it had a terrible hole in it when it gave the ability of American citizens to sue state sponsors of terrorism. And as my lawyer, Steve Perlis, and I started to lay out the parameters of this lawsuit, Steve Perlis realized that there were gaping holes in the statute. So we started in the summer of 1996 to get the law changed. And I would go to Washington, D.C. at least once a week for the next 8 weeks. And the one place you don't want to be in the summer is Washington, D.C.
That's where I live, so.
Well, you can cut the humidity with a knife. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And I would leave West Orange at 4 o'clock in the morning, be on the 440 Metro liner to Washington, D.C., get there at 8:30 in the morning, and then walk up to Capitol Hill from Union Station and start the day. If people have never been to Capitol Hill, they may not understand that the congressmen and the senators don't work at the Capitol building. They work in these office buildings that are on opposite sides of the campus, if you want to call it that, up and down the avenue. And we would have an appointment at a Senate office building in the morning. Then we'd have to go to the House building later on that morning, and back to the Senate, sometimes up to the House. It's up to the Capitol building itself to meet somebody. And at the end of the day, I was soaking wet. I was emotionally drained because we kept telling people our story over and over and over again as to the need for the law. Fortunately, we had several good people back us up. Senator Frank Lautenberg from New Jersey, Congressman Jim Saxton from New Jersey. And there was really nobody who could turn us down at the end of the day. So we had a law passed in late 1996, early 1997, that became dubbed the Flatow Amendment. And we sued the Iranian government. And we got a judgment of almost $250 million. And then we proceeded to try to collect on it. And that's when the Clinton administration stepped in to block our collection efforts. Not only block our collection efforts, they worked against us as well. So we went back to the Congress. We asked for some new legislation. We worked on getting that again. Same story, trying to buttonhole people, trying to curry favor, trying to explain what we're trying to accomplish. And it was hard for them to turn me down. But politics did rear its ugly head. We had a monumental piece of legislation adopted that would allow us to seize certain assets that we had identified, Iranian assets that we identified. But State Department and the White House insisted that it contain a waiver provision. In the event of national security, the White House could waive the provisions of this statute. So the law was signed by President Clinton on a Saturday, and Saturday afternoon he waived the provisions of the statute. Now, American Jews should be familiar with that so-called waiver provision because we had that same thing in the Jerusalem Embassy relocation bill that allowed the president to waive the provisions of the Relocation Act for national security purposes. And it was effective during President Clinton, during President Bush, and President Obama. And when President Trump came in, the law was still in effect. And President Trump said, I'm not going to waive the law. We're moving the embassy. So politics is politics. There's quids and there's pros and there's gives and there's takebacks. And it's like sausage. They tell you that it's great to eat, but you don't want to see it being made. It's daunting.
Tell me a little bit about what were you trying to really accomplish? I mean, I guess there was no way until then to sue another government.
Right. Well, there were the doctrine is called sovereign immunity. And basically it stops citizens from suing foreign countries or suing a state for that matter in the United States courts. But there are exceptions for foreign countries, mainly surrounding commerce. If you're selling something to, in those days, let's say Iran, because there were limited things that you could deal with them business-wise. And they didn't pay you could sue them in district court in Washington and litigate the price or litigate the quality of the goods, that kind of stuff. But when it came to terrorism, this is a brand new piece of law.
Why wouldn't that have been a no-brainer, like a common sense possibility?
Well, the State Department doesn't want the courts, but more importantly, doesn't want individuals interfering with the foreign policy of the United States. And I was accused of that at a meeting with Stuart Eisenstadt, who was then an Undersecretary of State.
He's been on the show, by the way.
He's a fascinating individual.
And his son is my neighbor. So
I happen to think he's one of the smartest people I've ever come across. I know that what he's done for the Jewish people is immeasurable. But at the same time, he made my life miserable for 3 years. But that's okay. I didn't hold it personal. I wrote about him in the book in not a flattering light, but it's not out of animosity. And he sat across this conference room from me and told me with strength in his voice that nobody dictates the foreign policy of the United States to the United States. And that's what he accused us of trying to do. In reality, what we were trying to do was get America to realize that there was an evil regime there that had taken the life not only of Elisa, but other Americans as well over the years. And perhaps by making them pay a financial price, it'll get them out of the terrorism business. The Clinton administration, via the State Department, therefore, when they drafted the original bill, watered it down. So I came along and I toughened it. I took out a lot of the water and made it stricter. The State Department worked against us every step of the way, which is what led to that waiver provision, by the way, that I mentioned before. So I didn't take what the State Department doing as being personal. People have said to me, well, they're just a bunch of anti-Semites, aren't they? And I said, no. And I still say no. They have a belief as to what America's foreign policy should be, and that belief is entrenched. When Donald Trump was inaugurated and he was starting to appoint people to various positions in the administration, Ira Stoll, who was a columnist in the Northeast, wrote a column about the Weebies. And basically, America has roughly 2.5 million people who work for the government. That's separate from the military, who work for the government. And they are civil servants. They cannot be fired unless for real malfeasance or some type of crime or something like that. They're protected. And anybody who comes in to be at the top of an office, whether it's state or commerce or treasury, runs across these career people. And their position is that we be here before you and we be here after you. Hence Ira's phrase of the Weebies. And they can work against the people who have been put in charge of their own departments. So if you have somebody who is sympathetic to what I'm trying to do, which wasn't the case with the State Department, don't get me wrong, they will work against their own leadership to slow them down, to convince them otherwise. Curiously, Martin Indyk, who was an ambassador to Israel when Elisa was murdered, I had the opportunity to meet with him in his office, purely a social call. And he made a comment to me. He said, you know, a president will not go against his advisors when they're all in a row on the issue. If there's a machlokas, if there's a fight amongst them, then he may make the ultimate decision. But he's not going to interfere with an administrative decision where everybody is in agreement. And then he said to me, unless there's pressure from the outside. And I didn't know what he really meant at the time until several months later, when Hillary Clinton decided she was going to run for the Senate in New York. And it dawned on us that this might be the leverage we need to get the Clinton administration to change their tack. So Hillary had this famous meeting in Ramallah with Su'a Arafat.
Su'a Arafat, the famous kissing picture.
That's right. It's in the book. And the story behind that is that Su'a Arafat is busy talking in Arabic to this audience. And what Hillary didn't know was what she was saying, plain and simple. And afterwards, they did the famous kisses. And I like to think that as Hillary was being walked back to her car after this meeting, somebody hit her in the back of the head and said, "What did you just do? Do you know what she said?" Basically, she was blaming Israelis and Jews for poisoning wells, giving kids AIDS and leukemia and cancer and you name it.
Of course, just the basics, yeah.
Right. And Hillary had a serious problem because the Jewish community picked up on this immediately. And I believe it was Joe Lieberman who convinced her that she has to make amends. And the best place to make amends for the Orthodox community was going to be the Orthodox Union in Manhattan. And he got her a meeting there. And I was asked to come down and ask her a question. So the question that Flatow asked was, Mrs. Clinton, are you in support of the administration's efforts that are blocking victims of state-sponsored terrorism for collecting on their judgments? And she said, no. Well, you could have knocked me over with a feather. And within a week or so, we got word that Jacob Rupp, who was then the Director, Office of Management and Budget, a firm man, who I admire greatly also.
He's a treasury guy now, right?
Yeah, became treasurer under Obama, that's right. They put him at the head of a negotiating committee between the lawyers for the victims and the American government. And after about a year, they cobbled together a law that allowed us to obtain 10% of our judgment, and that the money, and not only us, but other families as well, and the money would come out of a $400 million fund called the Foreign Military Sales Act, which was money that had been sent to America by the Iranian government before the Shah fell. And it had been in American custody for years, since 1978, 79. So the $400 million figure we didn't think included interest. That was one of Stu Eisenstadt's shticks, I think. Don't tell them what the fund is really up to now, because they may want it all. And as I said, we got a portion of our judgment paid. We can no longer pursue Iran in America, but that hasn't stopped us from going out of the country trying to pursue them in other foreign countries. We've been blocked by other foreign countries as well. So the interesting thing is, America put this charge on this money, and the plan was to reimburse the Treasury for the payments that went to the terror victims. And it turned out that right before President Obama left office, he sent that money back plus billions more to the Iranian government on a midnight flight. And he breathed new life into Iranian terrorism and trouble in the Middle East.
Do you know why he did that?
Well, the main reason is we believe that he was grateful for them signing off on the so-called nuclear agreement. Also, at the same time, they released, I think there were 2 Iranian Americans that were being held hostage under bogus circumstances in Iran, and they were released. Publicly, they said that by doing this, we're saving the American taxpayer billions and billions of dollars in interest and penalties and things like that. I don't buy it. It was simply a political move, one that we should have been embarrassed of, and one that has basically fomented such hardship and catastrophe in the Middle East. The war, the civil war in Syria, the civil war in Yemen, Hezbollah, Hamas, are basically Iranian clientele. And until the new wave of sanctions was put in place by the current Trump administration, the Iranians were having a field day with this money.
How did you know early on, by the way, that like why Iran? How did you know as soon as Lisa was murdered? It was obviously, I assume, one of the terror groups took responsibility, or you identified them. How did you immediately say, "Oh, Iran"? You're like, how did that all even develop?
The first thing was the day of the attack, Palestinian Islamic Jihad sent faxes out to the news media and to people in America.
You might have to explain to listeners what those are. Just another anachronism.
You're right. It's like me mentioning a phonograph needle. Boys and girls, a fax machine was a device where you're able to transmit written documents electronically through the phone system.
Like an email with paper.
Yeah, followed up by a phone call. Did you get my fax? We're digressing. So they sent this communication to the news media and to people here in America, taking credit for this horrific terror attack. Actually, there were two terror attacks that day, one in Kfar Darom and one that Hamas apparently perpetrated further north that didn't have any real victims. But the one at Kfar Darom killed 8 and wounded over 40. And then as we were discussing the potential litigation with the United States State Department, who didn't stop us, by the way, talking to us, they told us that Iran was a state sponsor of Islamic Jihad. And in fact, we came to learn that they even had a budget line item for sponsoring terrorism. And we showed that at trial eventually. So we knew that Iran was behind Islamic Jihad, that was behind Hamas at the time, but they weren't being punished. Iran wasn't being punished. So they were our defendant. They and their Revolutionary Guard and Ministry of the Interior, as well as their leadership, and we named them as defendants. Now, interestingly, we didn't name Islamic Jihad for a tactical reason. You didn't know how to find them. We knew that they had a guy in Damascus who somebody killed that fall of October 1995 after Lisa had been killed, murdered. And we kept them out to avoid this round and around getting jurisdiction. So we knew that Iran was responsible. And they are still listed as the #1 state sponsor of terrorism by the State Department.
Did they mount a defense? Like, did they show up in court and there's a guy in a suit there with, saying I defend Iran? Like, what? How does that even work?
Okay, you hit upon something very interesting. It goes back to the sovereign immunity cases for commercial transactions. In every single one of those cases, the Iranians appeared in court. And they hired a well-known Washington, D.C. attorney. So as Steve Perlis and I were mapping out the timeline, we figured they would use the same fellow, and it would take us 10 years to prove our case. Much to my surprise, and basically I think the State Department's also, the Iranians defaulted. They didn't appear in the action, but we still had to have a trial. So we had what's customarily called a proof hearing over 2 days in February of 1998. And we had testimony, we had documentary evidence, we had evidence that was put under seal by the court, because the way our attorneys got it was really below the table. And we demonstrated to the judge's satisfaction that Iran was the financial sponsor of the terrorists who murdered Elisa. And that gave them liability. And that's when he awarded us a judgment. Now, the timeline for that is very interesting, because we had the trial in February, and middle of the first week in March, we got a phone call from our lawyers saying that the judge wants to render his decision the following Tuesday. And I looked at the calendar, it was Thomas Esther. And I thought to myself, how appropriate.
Yeah, Persia, ancient Persia.
Right, the successors to Haman are in control of Iran, the successor to Persia. And that was the day that we got our judgment. So reading the Megillah that night resonated like it's never, ever resonated before and since, because here's a Jew who stood up for his daughter, for his people, and socked it to the Iranian government, not understanding at the time that there were more troubles and travails that would come along our way. But we made law. The case is still cited today, and actions brought against Iran and against Cuba and against the Palestinian Authority as being a fundamental case in the war on terrorism. And some people created the phrase lawfare to describe it. Many are unhappy with lawfare because, as Stu Eisenstadt said to me many years ago, which we talked about before, we're interfering in the political process. So other lawyers and other scholars have commented on that, and other people have said, no, this is good. This shines a light on what's happening in the real world, and it takes courage for a state to stand up and combat it. Now, one of the things that we don't seem to appreciate here in America is how the European countries have been working against American interests over the years when it comes to Iran. Italy, for instance, is one of Iran's biggest importers of Iranian oil. The Brits and the Germans are all trying to figure out ways, because of the European Union, not the British so much anymore, but now the European Union countries are trying to figure out ways how to evade the Trump sanctions, the imposition of sanctions. So it's what I call, then I still call, head scratchers. But, geographically, they're around the corner from Iran, and they're kind of afraid, I think, of what Iran can do physically and electronically through hacking and stuff like that. So basically, I think they're paying blackmail.
Did you initially, when you had this judgment, did you expect to collect?
No, Steve and I, we said, we'll get a nickel at the end of 10 years. But once we got the judgment, Perlis and Thomas Fay, who was our litigator, they had the claws out. They were not letting anything go by. And the very first piece of property we identified was a former embassy property in Washington. It was actually a consulate building that the ambassador resided in. And we went after it. And that's when the Treasury Department stepped in and started banging us around. So that was the reason for some of the other litigation that we had to.
There's no way to really. You can't go to Iran and say, write me a check, right? So you have to find assets that they own elsewhere and.
Right. Exactly. So that Foreign Military Sales Act account was an asset, and the rentals that the State Department has been collecting on this house in Washington and other Iranian properties, which are kind of sequestered, was an asset. The biggest asset we found, though, was an ownership interest in an office building in Manhattan. And it's on Fifth Avenue. And it's one of these 40-story towers. And we learned that an Iranian, quote, charity owned a piece of it called the Alavi Foundation. Now, the Alavi Foundation was originally the Pahlavi Foundation, Pahlavi being the family name of the Shah of Iran. And when the Shah fell, the Iranian government took over ownership of the foundation, but they gave it a really weird name. It was the Mustasaven Foundation. Mustasaven means fund for martyrs, something like that. And somebody then woke up one day in Tehran or in New York and said, this is a crazy name for a nonprofit. So let's change it to Alavi. So Alavi means son of Ali. And that's who the Shias believe succeeded Muhammad as the prophet. All the stuff I've learned, you could...
You could give a class in comparative religion, yeah.
So we claimed that the Alavi Foundation was a front for the Iranian government. We found textual sources written by a finance professor in Iran who wouldn't help us in the case. He wouldn't give us an affidavit to testify. So we brought a seizure motion against the property. The State Department and Justice Department came in with a bogus affidavit that claimed we have no interest in the building. The Iranian government has no interest in the Alavi Foundation or in the building. And my case was quashed by a U.S. District Court judge in Manhattan. 6 years later, Robert Morgenthau, who was then the district attorney in Manhattan, starts looking at the Iranian terrorism support around the world. And one of his folks looks at our case and says, what the heck is this building? Well, they did their own digging, and they realized it was an Iranian asset. Well, the federal government now hears this. This is even under the Obama administration, too. That first it started under the Bush administration. They say, my God, we got an Iranian asset here. We're going to seize it. So everything that I had told them in the late 90s, they now reversed themselves and said it was an Iranian asset. And several years ago, they started forfeiture proceedings. Unfortunately, those proceedings are still ongoing because a lobby didn't own the entire building. They had an interest in it. And if the federal government tries to sell the entire building, they've got a problem with their co-owners, because why should the co-owner be penalized?
Well, why can't they sell the stake?
Well, this is all part of the argument. This is all part of the argument. Because even selling a stake might devalue the worth of the building if it doesn't go for true fair market value. And everybody wants a bargain. So the lobby interest is still floating around in this office building, but it just demonstrated how the information we developed was accurate when we did. And the State Department could have taken a totally different tact in the late 90s, instead of forcing us to go back to the Congress, beating up Hillary Clinton, beating up President Clinton, and changing the law again.
So to this day, have you collected?
We collected 10% of our judgment in 2001. And that money was supposed to have come from the Foreign Sales Act. But as Jack Lew explained to me, that all money has come out of the Treasury. But don't worry, we have this offsetting provision that was never honored. So basically, the taxpayers paid us and the other victims who collected as well. About $400 million was distributed out of that money.
Weren't you asking to create a law that would then be retroactive? Or it's, at the time of Alyssa's murder, the law didn't exist, or the provisions that you later lobbied for didn't exist. So how did you apply it retroactively?
Ex post facto, which is what you're talking about, changing a law after the act, only applies in criminal cases.
So civilly, you can go back ad infinitum?
Well, I would think that there might be a civil statute of limitations that you would look at, unless it's been suspended, which does happen occasionally in civil law. Or they create a new period of limitations. They say, look, these acts have happened so many years ago. We're giving you 1 year or 2 years to start your action now. And that kind of revives everything. But you have to hang that on something. Usually that type of loophole surrounds a person's age. Let's say a sexual assault victim who was 5 at the time. And 20 some odd years later, they may be able to bring the action. They couldn't do it while they were, they could do it while they were a child, but no one never did anything. So there were carve-outs and there were exceptions. The biggest problem that we have today is that, as I said before, the Iranians are still in the business. What I did, what other people have done, hasn't put them out. What Trump is trying to do, I think, is to convince them that the best way forward is to come to terms with your record and admit what you've done. And actually, when people ask me that questions, the question usually being, well, don't you think that America should have relations with Iran? And my answer is yes. But I think that Iran has to own up to what they've done. I mean, paying compensation to terror victims would be a drop in their financial bucket, really. But they refuse to simply do so. We're the great Satan. America's the great Satan, along with little Israel. Jews, no matter what stripe we are all a fair target as far as they're concerned. And it's just an evil, evil regime.
Is anything ongoing at this point? Where are things right now?
Well, what I'm waiting on is Mashiach to come, the Messiah to come, right?
Amen.
I guess we all are, and we're going to wait until he's tarrying. We're going to wait. What I'd love to see, frankly, is the overthrow of the Iranian regime. I'd love to see Iran, the new government of Iran, make amends for its actions over the years. I'd like to see them pay reparations to Israel, to Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, even the Saudis, I suppose, the destruction they've rendered there. People have died needlessly because of Iranian desire to be the leader of the world.
Tell me about the book. When did you decide to write it, and why? And how has that process been?
Well, I started to, in my own mind, to write the book in the late 90s when I was on the speaking circuit. And I was going to different Jewish communities. I was appearing at City Hall. I was in the streets outside the Palestinian mission to the United Nations. And I said, I'm doing things. And I started like writing down what I was doing. And I took one chapter and I tried to describe my day. But there was something missing. I wasn't really expressing why I was doing all these things and what kind of influence I had. And then a few years ago, I met a book publisher who said, you have a good story here. I want you to sit down with somebody and I want you to talk. And I met this professor. He teaches nonfiction writing. And we spoke for 2 hours. And within a week or so, a draft of the first chapter came back to me. It's the first chapter of the book as it is now. And the approach I decided to take was a nonlinear approach. So it doesn't begin in 1979 when Elisa goes to school. It begins with our 60 Minutes interview. And my writings were incorporated, my speeches were incorporated, and we just shaped it in what I think is such a beautiful way that it's a quick read. It's 210 pages. Many people have read it over 2 Shabbos afternoons. Some people, I know, they said they read it all Shabbos. They started Friday night. They didn't finish till Shabbos was over, but they read the book. And I talk about my parents, talk about my upbringing, different experiences I had growing up that would make me who I was, and Elisa's experiences growing up made her who she was. And it's a nice read. We had 1,000 copies printed. I think we're down to our last 50 or so. So we're getting ready to go back to the printer and come out with a what they call a trade paperback. It's not a small paperback. It's a bigger book. It'll be the same number of pages. I'm thinking of writing the new epilogue to it now. Actually, I started drafting the newest epilogue, bring people up to date. But the content of the book itself, to me, and I hope this doesn't sound too conceited, the content itself is timeless. It has lessons, at least that was what I was trying to accomplish, which we finally did. The lessons that we pulled out of each step of the process. And I just couldn't get it down on paper correctly. Now I'm writing columns, mostly dealing with Palestinian terrorism, although I have a doozy that I'm working on about the difference between COVID-19 and polio and how the public is reacting to it. Because I grew up during the age of polio in the 50s. And my mother used to warn me, don't go swimming. I was in Queens. Who had a pool? But this is what we used to hear. And I think that's also why a lot of us went to the Catskills for the summers. For some reason, we thought that being away from the city, you wouldn't get polio, but no one thought about Franklin Roosevelt, who was on vacation up in Canada, when he contracted polio in the late 19 teens. So there's a lot to write about: annexation, applying Israeli law to communities, Palestinian admiration and love of terrorism, their inability to say yes to an Israeli proposal. Lots of topics. I try to put out a column a week, and they're generally well received. I've been called on the carpet by a couple of people that I've criticized, and they're welcome to do so. I stand behind what I write. I try not to be personal. I try not to be strident. I try to make a case for what I'm trying to get across. And it's also over the last few years, I've accumulated 150, 175, 200 columns. And the work goes on.
What's the book called?
A Father's Story: My Fight for Justice Against Iranian Terror.
Beautiful. And finally, just share a little bit about how is this entire process from, of course, the tragedy, the murder in the 90s, through all the advocacy work, through all the writing, everything you've been through, how do you think it's affected and changed you?
Well, it's actually changed my entire family. And I didn't realize that. until a couple of years ago. But at the very beginning, I learned that each parent reacts differently. I was fortunate. I was asked to tell Elisa's story for United Jewish Appeal, State of Israel Bonds, and other organizations. And I would go out and I would meet 250, sometimes 1,000 strangers, and I would tell Elisa's story about Yiddishkeit and Israel and things like that, but conclude with the fact that we're all in this together. We're all in this together, in Jewish life together. And that you've got to stand up and do the right thing. Now, I began speaking literally at Elisa's funeral. My daughter Francine, who was then 15 years old, and turned to me and said, "Daddy, are you going to speak?" And I said, "No, Fran, I don't really want to. Just you have to speak. You have to make people cry for Elisa." And I got up and I spoke for a few minutes. And then I sat down and she held my hand. Francine held my hand when I was done. And just by going out and talking about Elisa, it was very cathartic for me. First 5 years, my back would be drenched after every presentation, which I learned is talking about is the way you overcome your survivor stress. Basically is what it is. But my wife couldn't talk about her at all. If you mentioned Elisa, her presence, her eyes would well up, tears. It took her almost 15 years to kind of adapt. But that's fine. That was her privacy, and nobody would invade it or anything like that. And then 2 years ago, Francine was having a hard time with her oldest daughter, Michal. And Michal had just hit teenage years. So Francine said to me, "I don't know how to react because, Gail and I and Alana, we kind of laid off of you. And she didn't have the same experience doing to us what Michal was doing to her. So she didn't know how to respond." So everybody was affected. I came across today a photo of, as I'm going through papers, I'm scanning. It was a short news article in the New Jersey Star-Ledger of my daughter Gail with Elisa's heart recipient, Jacob Salinas from Petach Tikva. And here's Gail. She wasn't even 19 years old at the time, dealing with a guy who received Elisa's heart. But like we say, Gail is Gail. She bounces off walls. Very resilient, but at the same time, inside, she's a different person. The grandchildren are different also because they hear a lot of Elisa stories. For a young woman who had 20 years of life, she imparted a lot. We have 4 granddaughters named after her, and she lives that way. So at the end of the day, it is definitely a life-altering experience losing a child to terror, but it's a life-altering experience to any parent who loses a child because no one is prepared to address you. Rabbis, priests, ministers, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists. A lot of it has to come from who you are yourself. And I was fortunate. I got up off the ground and I went back to life.
Stephen Flatow, father, author, advocate, attorney, activist. I think I got all the A's and I threw an F in there, but
I got one of those too once. So.
Just to keep you humble. But thank you so much for joining us.
Good to speak with you, Ari.
This has been Ari Koretsky on Jews You Should Know. Please visit us at JewsYouShouldKnow.com and subscribe at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume podcasts. Find us on social media at Jews You Should Know. If you'd like to become a supporter of this podcast, we would greatly appreciate that, and you can do so by visiting patreon.com. That's patreon.com/JewsYouShouldKnow. Finally, if you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review so that we can continue to grow and introduce many more people to Jews You Should Know.